The Riverside subdivision stretched across 7 blocks of cookie-cutter perfection. Every lawn was mowed to exactly 2 inches. Every driveway was sealed and striped. Every mailbox was the same shade of bronze. It was the kind of neighborhood where people didn't have friends, they had neighborhood associations and committees. Corinne Mitchell lived at 447 Oakmont Drive, in a house that cost $847,000 and looked like every other house on the block, except that hers had a pool. Not just any pool, a lagoon-style custom build that had taken 8 months and a contractor's net worth to complete. The edges curved like a natural spring. The bottom graduated from 3 feet to 6 feet, in a way that made it look like an actual tropical destination, had been surgically inserted into suburban Ohio. She'd hosted exactly 3 pool parties since its completion 6 months ago. Each one had been orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. Every guest invited had been vetted for appropriate attire, beverage choices, and conversation quality. No kids, no splashing, no cannonballs. The pool was Corinne's rebellion against the ordinary. It was her declaration that she had won something in this life. On the morning of August 14th at 9:47 a.m., Corinne stood in her kitchen with a steaming mug of unsweetened green tea and watched the neighborhood through her French doors. The sun was already brutal, 93 degrees with humidity that made the air taste like wet concrete. Her pool sparkled like the most beautiful thing in the world. She had just decided to call the country club and book a massage when she heard the sound. Laughter, kid laughter, multiple children coming from her backyard. Corinne had installed a 6-foot fence specifically to prevent this kind of intrusion. Privacy was part of the whole point, but kids didn't understand property lines. Kids didn't understand anything beyond their immediate desires. She set down her tea, a decision that would later feel significant, a moment of normalcy before everything broke, and walked out onto the deck. There were 4 of them. 3 girls she recognized from the neighborhood, probably middle school age, and 1 boy who looked older, maybe 13 or 14. He was tall, gangly in that way teenage boys were, with the kind of face that hadn't quite decided what it was going to look like when it finished growing. She knew his name was Marcus something, that his parents had moved in 3 houses down about a year ago, and that there had been some kind of incident at school involving him and another student, though the details had been vague in the neighborhood gossip chain. "This is private property," Corinne said, her voice the way one speaks to a small dog that's wandered into one's yard. The 3 girls immediately looked stricken. They were good kids, clearly the type who understood consequences and hierarchy. They were already backing toward the gate. But Marcus looked at the pool, then at Corinne, and something in his expression didn't shift from amusement to contrition the way it was supposed to. "We were just looking," he said. "Lexi said it looked like the Atlantis resort." "This is not a public facility," Corinne repeated, maintaining her composure in the way she maintained everything in her life, with an iron grip on perfection. "Please leave." One of the girls, a small one with red hair, started to say, "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Mitchell, we didn't mean." "The gate is through there," Corinne said, pointing with her chin. She didn't move. She wanted them to have to walk past her to feel the weight of trespassing. They shuffled out, the girls apologizing, Marcus quiet now but not quite humiliated enough for Corinne's satisfaction. When the gate closed behind them, she went back inside, back to her tea, back to her perfect morning. She should have felt satisfied. She should have felt in control. Instead, for reasons she wouldn't examine too closely, she felt angry in a way that didn't quite make sense. The anger had claws. The anger had teeth. Marcus walked his friends out of the neighborhood, past the rows of identical houses, toward the commercial strip where there was a Dollar General, a vape shop, and a Subway. His face was still hot with humiliation, though he'd worked hard to keep it smooth, to keep Corinne Mitchell from seeing how much her dismissal had landed. "Your mom's friend is kind of a bitch," Lexi said, which wasn't even accurate. Corinne wasn't his mom's friend, wasn't anyone's friend, was just another adult proving that they had what you didn't and would make sure you knew it. "She's just protecting her pool," one of the other girls said, trying to be diplomatic in the way that made Marcus want to scream. He didn't say anything. He had learned over the course of 3 months in this neighborhood that saying things usually made situations worse. His parents had moved here for a fresh start after the situation at Lincoln Middle School, where he'd punched a kid named Trevor because Trevor had done something that was nobody's business. His mom kept saying that Marcus had a problems with impulse control, which Marcus thought was a generous way of saying that when the pressure built up inside him, it had to go somewhere, and sometimes that somewhere was Trevor's face. The move was supposed to fix it. New school, new house, new neighborhood, new Marcus. It wasn't working. When the group reached the commercial strip, the girls wanted to go into the Dollar General to look at nail polish. Marcus said he'd meet them in a few minutes and walked into the vape shop instead, where a bored teenager with green hair sold him a mango-flavored disposable pen without checking his ID. He stood outside for a while, watching the heat shimmer off the pavement, pulling the sweet vapor into his lungs and trying to feel something other than rage. His dad worked in construction. His dad was good at it because his dad understood that if you didn't like something, you demolished it. If a wall was in the way, you took it down. If something was broken, you didn't preserve it, you started over. That made sense. That was honest. His mom wanted him to be more delicate. She wanted him to think before he acted, to control his impulses, to be someone who could exist peacefully in neighborhoods like Riverside, where people had pools, and didn't want kids like him looking at them. As he stood there, vaping mango flavor and hatting Corinne Mitchell with the focused intensity of a 13-year-old boy, Marcus noticed something. 2 houses down from Corinne's, there was a yard being landscaped. The contractor's truck was parked in the driveway, and on the back of the truck bed, clearly visible, was a collection of supplies. Landscape dye, mulch colorant, 5-gallon buckets of it in various shades. He'd seen that kind of thing before. His dad had used something similar to stained concrete in their new basement. The dye in those buckets was intense. 1 bucket could turn a whole pool. He stopped the thought. He was literally standing here, thinking about doing something that would be profoundly stupid, to a woman who had done nothing except treat him like he didn't belong, which, fair enough, he didn't. He took another hit of mango and started walking back toward the Dollar General. But he kept thinking about it. Corinne spent the afternoon aggressively organizing her closet, a task she undertook whenever she felt unsettled. Unsettled was not a thing she typically experienced. Unsettled was for people without systems and structure. Yet here she was, removing every item of clothing from her walk-in closet and inspecting it for wrinkles, stains, or any sign of degradation. She was unsettled because of a 13-year-old boy and his amusement. Her husband, David, was in Seattle at a tech conference. He always was somewhere at conferences. He'd been gone so much over the past 5 years that Corinne sometimes felt like she was living in a house she'd built for a life that didn't actually exist. David had wanted the pool. David had said it would be aspirational for them, a symbol of success, but David was never here to enjoy it. Corinne was always here, alone with the pool, alone with the perfection she'd constructed, alone with the creeping sense that something was missing from the equation. She hung her blouses in order of color, from white to cream to pale blue to navy. She did the same with her pants. When she was done, her closet looked like a menswear catalog. It was almost 6 when she went downstairs to make dinner: grilled chicken breast, brown rice, steamed broccoli. The same dinner she'd made 4 days a week for the past 2 years. She ate at her kitchen island, scrolling through her phone when she saw a notification on the neighborhood app. It was a post from Jennifer Chen, 2 houses down from Corinne. Jennifer was asking if anyone had accidentally borrowed a 5-gallon bucket of landscape dye from her yard. "Just a heads up that there's some construction supplies visible from the street," Jennifer wrote. "If anyone's kids are around, just want to make sure nothing goes missing." The post had been made an hour ago. There were already 17 comments, mostly from other homeowners assuring Jennifer that their children would never, and asking for details about the dye, wondering if it was toxic. Corinne finished her chicken. She rinsed her plate and loaded it into the dishwasher in the designated spot where it belonged. It took Marcus 3 days to work up the courage. 3 days of his parents noticing he was quieter than usual, his mom asking if everything was okay at the new school, his dad telling him to toughen up and stop being so sensitive. 3 days of seeing Corinne Mitchell in his mind, her dismissal, her assumption that he was the kind of kid who should be grateful just to look at something that wasn't his. On the 3rd day, he waited until his parents were both asleep. His house was in that weird phase where summer was turning to late summer, where there was a difference between 10 p.m. and midnight, between the time adults went to bed and the time the world actually got quiet. He snuck out through the basement window. It was easy. Nothing in his life was actually difficult. The neighborhood was empty, streetlights hummed. An occasional porch light glowed in the darkness of a house where someone was still awake. Most of the windows were dark. He made his way to Jennifer's house, moving along the property line, staying in shadows where there were shadows. The landscape supplies were still there, right where he'd seen them. The 5-gallon bucket was propped against a stack of mulch bags, visible even in the darkness. He picked it up. It was heavier than he'd expected, maybe 40 pounds. His muscles strained slightly as he carried it. He felt simultaneously invincible and terrified, that exact feeling that came just before he did something he shouldn't. The pool was dark when he approached it. The gate was locked, but the latch was simple. He was over the fence in seconds, dropping down onto the expensive deck he wasn't supposed to step on. The water was black in the darkness, just a dark shape of something that shouldn't be disturbed. He positioned himself at the deep end, bucket in both hands, and thought about stopping. This moment where he could stop, he thought about it. He was aware of it. He was aware that this was one of those moments where he could still turn around, take the bucket back, forget this had ever happened. He thought about Corinne Mitchell's face, not angry, worse, unimpressed. He tilted the bucket. The dye poured out. It was almost beautiful, the way it bloomed through the water in dark purple and black, spreading like poison, like an infection, like something beautiful being ruined. The whole pool began to change color right before his eyes, transformed from something clean and pristine into something foul and wrong. He stood there for maybe 10 seconds, just watching, and then he ran. He ran back over the fence, back through the darkness, back along the property lines where no one was watching. His heart hammered in his chest. His lungs burned. He didn't slow down until he was back at his house, until he'd climbed through the basement window, until he was in his bed in the darkness trying to control his breathing enough that his parents wouldn't notice. When he finally slept, he dreamed of purple water and Corinne Mitchell's face. Corinne woke at 6 a.m., as she did every morning, regardless of what day it was. Her body was a machine with good programming. She showered with cool water, applied her skincare routine in the exact order dermatologists recommended, and dressed in a tennis outfit she had no intention of wearing to play tennis. She made green tea. She stood at the French doors with her mug looking out at her backyard. At first, her brain didn't process what she was seeing. The pool was purple, not a little purple, not partially purple. The entire surface was a murky, sludgy purple-black that looked like something had died in it, like disease had taken physical form. Corinne's mug slipped from her fingers. It didn't break on the tile floor, which felt wrong. Something should have broken, something should have shattered because the entire world was breaking. She walked out onto the deck. She walked down the steps. She walked to the edge of the pool and stared at it. The water had taken on the color of a bruise, of something infected, of ruin. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and called the pool contractor who'd built it. He didn't answer. She called again, still nothing. She left a message, her voice steady despite the way her vision was starting to narrow at the edges. "There's been an incident with my pool. I need you to call me immediately." She called her husband. It was 6:40 a.m. and he was in Seattle, but that didn't matter. The call went to voicemail. He had the phone on silent in his hotel room, sleeping in after the conference, sleeping in that way he was always allowed to do. She stood there for maybe 20 minutes, just staring at the destroyed thing, trying to understand how something could be so perfectly fine and then be so completely ruined. Then something shifted in her, something hardened. This wasn't an accident. You didn't accidentally dump a bucket of landscape dye into a pool. This was malicious. This was intentional. This was someone choosing to destroy her property, and that someone was Marcus something, the boy with the lack of respect and the expression that said he didn't care what anyone thought. Corinne went inside and called the police. Officer David Hernandez was 6 months from retirement and had perfected the art of listening to complaints with 40% of his actual attention. He'd responded to 12,000 complaints in his 28 years on the force. About 11,900 of them had been resolvable with a conversation and maybe an apology. The remaining 100 had required actual police work. He had a sense that this one was going to be in that category, and not the good way. Corinne Mitchell was a thin woman in her 50s with the kind of posture that suggested she'd never relaxed in her life. She stood on her deck in a tennis outfit, pointing at a purple pool, and spoke in the clipped tones of someone reporting a capital crime. I would like to file a formal report for criminal property damage, she said. The estimated value of the damage is in excess of $10,000. I know who did it. It was the boy living at 442 Oak Hill Drive, Marcus. I don't know his last name, but he's about 13 or 14 tall, and he trespassed on my property 3 days ago. When I asked him to leave, he looked at my pool in a way that suggested intent. Officer Hernandez wrote this down because he was a professional, but he was also thinking about retirement. He was thinking about a beach. He was thinking about how he didn't want to spend his next 6 months dealing with a neighborhood war over vandalism that he didn't have any actual evidence for. "Did you see him do this?" he asked. "No," Karen said, "but I saw him trespassing. I saw him looking at my pool, and now my pool is destroyed. The logic is elementary." "The logic," Officer Hernandez said gently, "would suggest those things might be connected. But logic isn't evidence, and evidence is what we need to file charges." Karen's jaw tightened. "So because I didn't install a camera, because I didn't expect a child to commit a felony in my backyard, there are no consequences?" "I didn't say that," Officer Hernandez said. "I said we'd need evidence. Do you have any? Did you see him last night? Did anyone else? Do you have security cameras?" "No cameras," Karen said, and he could see the moment she realized that this had been an oversight, that she'd built a perfect life but had failed to fortify it completely. "But I'm sure if you check, you'll find the dye was taken from." She pulled out her phone and scrolled. "Jennifer Chen's house, 2 addresses down." Officer Hernandez made a note. He would, in fact, check with Jennifer. But he was also fairly confident that she didn't have security footage of her landscape supplies either, because most people didn't, because they lived in neighborhoods where they trusted each other. "I'll talk to the family," he said. "I'll ask some questions, but unless someone admits to it or unless you have evidence, my hands are somewhat tied." "Then I'll find evidence," Karen said, "and I'll find justice, one or the other." There was something in her voice that should have made Officer Hernandez pay closer attention. There was a quality of determination that suggested she wasn't going to accept the limitations of the law. But he was tired, and he had 23 days until retirement, and so he just nodded, took down her information, and promised to follow up. He was in the kitchen, eating cereal straight from the box, which his mom hated, when his dad called from the living room that there was someone here to see him. Not someone here to see the family. Someone here to see him specifically. The precision of the pronouncement made Marcus's stomach drop. Officer David Hernandez was tall, brown-skinned, with the kind of face that had seen a lot and forgiven most of it. He stood in Marcus's living room in his uniform, looking vaguely uncomfortable, and asked Marcus if he had ever been in Karen Mitchell's backyard. Marcus's mom materialized from upstairs. Marcus's dad stopped pretending to watch television. The 3 of them became a unit, protective and terrified in equal measure. "I might have looked at her pool once," Marcus said, which was technically true. "Some of the girls in the neighborhood wanted to see it." "And did you return to the property last night?" Officer Hernandez asked. "No," Marcus said, and the lie came out smooth as butter. He was good at this part. This was the part where you looked at someone and agreed with their assumptions and hoped they had other things to do. "Someone dumped a bucket of landscape dye into her pool," Officer Hernandez said, watching Marcus's face closely. "She thinks it was you." Marcus felt his parents tense on either side of him. He felt their faith in him, which was so fragile it was almost transparent. "It wasn't me," he said. "Why would I do that? I don't even know this person." Officer Hernandez didn't accuse him. He just asked some more questions about what Marcus had been doing last night, whether he knew anything about the incident, whether he'd ever stolen anything before. There was something almost gentle about the interrogation, which made it worse somehow. Finally, Officer Hernandez said he'd be back if any evidence came to light, and that was it. He left. The living room fell back into silence. "It wasn't you," his mom said. "It wasn't a question." "It wasn't me," Marcus confirmed. His dad went back to his television. His mom went back to whatever she'd been doing upstairs. Marcus went back to his cereal. But his hands were shaking. Officer Hernandez drove to Jennifer Chen's house next, where Jennifer confirmed that, yes, she had landscape dye. Yes, some might be missing. No, she didn't have cameras. And yes, she'd heard that the Mitchell pool was destroyed. "I feel terrible," Jennifer said. "I posted about the supplies being visible. I basically invited this." "You didn't invite anyone to steal from you," Officer Hernandez said, "but it does confirm the dye came from your property." He stood in Jennifer's yard in the brutal morning heat and thought about what he actually knew. Someone had dumped dye into Corinne Mitchell's pool. The dye likely came from Jennifer's yard. Corinne Mitchell suspected Marcus, mostly because he'd trespassed once and had an expression she didn't like. There was something about the whole thing that felt constructed, like Corinne Mitchell had assembled all the pieces into an accusation that was more about what she wanted to be true than what was actually true. But he had a job, and the job was to follow up. So he pulled out his notes and drove to the Mitchell house, where Corinne was standing in her yard, staring at the still purple pool, dressed in different clothes now, but with the same expression of someone who had been personally wronged by the universe. "I need to see your pool equipment," he said. "The water won't stay like this. The dye will settle or disperse. I'd like to photograph the current state and check your pool equipment for any signs of tampering." Corinne led him to the shed where her expensive pool equipment was housed. Everything was unlocked, unguarded, essentially protected by the assumption that no one in Riverside would bother it. Officer Hernandez took photos. He made notes. And then he looked at Corinne and said, "This is a relatively affluent neighborhood. Forensic investigation of property damage. This isn't criminal. I can file a report. You can file a claim with your insurance, but pursuing charges against a specific person without evidence could be libelous." "It was the boy," Corinne said. "I know it was." "Knowing and proving are different things," Officer Hernandez said, not unkindly. "I'm going to do my job. I'm going to follow up on the leads I have. But I'm telling you my professional experience, accusations without evidence tend to blow back on the person making them." He was trying to warn her. He would later reflect on this moment and realize that he'd been trying to give her a way out, a path that didn't lead to the place her rage was determined to take her. She didn't take it. Corinne hired a lawyer named Derek Kessler who specialized in property disputes, and who had the kind of online reviews that suggested he was litigious in the way some people were religious. It was the central organizing principle of his existence. Derek was happy to meet with her, happy to hear about her pool, happy to discuss options, which was his euphemism for ways to make her rage someone else's problem. "Without definitive proof, a criminal case is unlikely," Derek said, his office full of hardwood and leather that screamed expensive. "However, you could pursue civil litigation for damages. We could file suit against the family, claim emotional distress, property damage, diminished property value. Even if we don't win, litigation itself becomes the punishment." Corinne understood what he was saying. Litigation was a weapon. Litigation was how people with money defended their territory. "File it," she said. Derek nodded, already making notes, already calculating billable hours. "I'll need some information about the family. Name, employer, insurance information if you have it." Corinne pulled out her phone and searched the neighborhood directory. Marcus's father was Robert, last name Freeman. He worked for Freeman Construction, his own company, which meant his assets were substantial and would be attractive to the kind of lawsuit that was about to be filed. Derek looked pleased. "I'll prepare the complaint. We're looking at property damage, negligent supervision, and emotional distress." Marcus's dad got the papers 4 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon, handed to him by a process server at his job site, while his employees watched and understood immediately what it meant. Rob Freeman was not a man who processed bad news quietly. He came home and told Marcus's mom what had happened, and then he came to find Marcus in his room. "Did you do this?" Rob asked, not angrily, worse, directly. "Did you dump dye into that woman's pool?" "No," Marcus said. "Because if you did, we deal with it. We pay for it and you deal with the consequences. I know you've been struggling. I know the move was hard. But I need you to tell me the truth right now." Marcus met his father's eyes and lied again. "I didn't do it." Rob looked at his son for a long time, and something in his face suggested he was unsure about what he believed. "We need to go talk to the lawyer," he said finally. "This is civil litigation. She's suing us for damages." The neighborhood fractured along expected lines. The people who had money sided with Corinne, or at least remained neutral, which was effectively the same thing. The people with less money, the people who recognized something of themselves in Rob Freeman's situation, started talking about Corinne in a different way. There were posts on the neighborhood app, deleted quickly but screenshots taken. For a neighborhood supposed to be about community, some people seem more interested in war. How has anyone proven it was the kid? Is this just how we do things now? This is why I hate HOA neighborhoods. Someone's always looking for the next fight. Corinne's response to the social media backlash was to become more entrenched in her righteousness. She believed Marcus was guilty. She believed the legal system was too weak to protect property owners. She believed that sometimes justice required more than the police, more than the courts. She started documenting everything. She ordered security cameras and had them installed on her property, angled at the pool, at the fence, at the gate. She joined 3 different neighborhood watch groups. She started attending city council meetings to advocate for better police response times in wealthy residential areas. Officer Hernandez, who'd been planning a peaceful retirement, found himself being dragged into conversations about accountability and justice. Corinne called him regularly, asking for updates on the investigation, demanding that he do more, test the water, analyze the dye chemically, talk to the boy again. There's no evidence, he told her for the 5th time, 6th time, 70th time. Then find evidence, she said. That's your job. And the worst part was that he'd wanted to retire. He'd been ready to retire. But now, 2 weeks before his retirement date, Corinne Mitchell walked into the station with a folder full of documentation about Marcus Freeman and demanded to speak to the police chief. The story of the pool made it to the local news by late August. "Suburban Mother Battles Neighborhood Vandal" was the headline, which was technically inaccurate since no vandal had been definitively identified. But that was the kind of thing that happened when your lawyer was talking to reporters and framing the narrative. Derek Kessler was good at framing narratives. Derek Kessler understood that he didn't need to win the lawsuit to win the war. He needed to make Corinne Mitchell's story the official story, a narrative about a hardworking mother whose property had been destroyed by a careless teenager, a story about an outdated justice system, a story about how wealthy people couldn't even protect what they'd built without jumping through hoops. Local news interviewed Corinne, who'd hired a media consultant to perfect her concerned but fair presentation. She spoke about giving the benefit of the doubt, while making it clear that she'd done plenty of doubting. She spoke about wanting justice for all involved, while pursuing the most vindictive civil case a lawyer could construct. The news crew filmed her pool, which she'd drained and was now repainting. They filmed her standing in her yard, arms crossed, looking every inch the wronged property owner. They did not interview Marcus, because Marcus was a minor and his parents had wisely kept him off camera. But they did a whole segment on teenage crime in affluent neighborhoods, which featured an entirely different teenager who'd shoplifted from a Whole Foods, but the implication was clear. Teenagers in rich neighborhoods were out of control. Kids like Marcus Freeman were a problem that needed to be solved. The lawsuit progressed. Derek filed motions. Rob Freeman hired a lawyer of his own, a younger woman named Sarah Chen who was good but didn't have Derek's experience in making noise. The 2 lawyers argued about discovery, about how much evidence the defense could demand, about what was relevant and what was pure harassment. Sarah kept telling Rob that the case was weak, that Derek was bluffing, that they could probably get it dismissed on summary judgment. But summary judgment took time, and time meant legal bills, and legal bills meant Rob Freeman had to pull money out of his construction business, and pulling money out of his business meant he had to lay off employees. 3 people lost their jobs because of the pool. That was a statistic that would later matter, though not in any official sense. Marcus, meanwhile, was starting his freshman year at Riverside High School, where he was already known as the kid who maybe vandalized that woman's pool. None of the actual facts had penetrated the gossip mill. All that had made it through was Marcus Freeman and pool and rich lady. The permutations were endless, and all of them were bad. He ate lunch alone. Girls wouldn't talk to him. In gym class, his equipment went missing, then magically reappeared, torn. In English, the teacher made a pointed comment about some people thinking they could do whatever they wanted, and some people having consequences they couldn't escape. He went home and didn't tell his parents. What was the point? They were already drowning. Corinne attended the first real deposition in mid-September in Derek's office, where Marcus was brought along with his mother and his lawyer. The deposition was technically confidential, but Derek made sure someone from the local news knew about it, and so there were photographers outside the building, and so the visual of the Freeman family, Rob working too hard, Marcus's mom worried into submission, Marcus himself looking terrified, became part of the narrative. Derek asked Marcus questions designed to make him sound guilty. Have you ever been angry at adults? Have you ever been in trouble at school? Do you have friends who might have done this for you? Are you sure you didn't do this? Sarah objected repeatedly. Marcus answered mostly with I don't know and no, but the tone of it, the mounting fear, looked a lot like evasion on camera. Karen watched the whole thing from a chair in the corner of the room, and something in her expression was not triumphant. It was something closer to empty, like she was watching the destruction of the Freeman family the way she'd watched the destruction of the pool, with a kind of fascinated detachment from reality. After the deposition, Derek pulled her aside and asked if she wanted to increase the settlement demand. They were currently asking for $14,000 for repairs, emotional distress, and legal fees. They could push for 30. I don't want a settlement, Karen said. I want admission of guilt. Derek made a note. He'd worked with people like Karen before. Her pool was just a symbol. What she really wanted was for everyone to acknowledge that she'd been wronged, that the world owed her recompense, that justice was finally, mathematically, completely on her side. That's not how settlements work, he said gently. Then we go to trial, Karen said. We go to trial and we prove it. Derek made another note. Going to trial in a civil case you didn't have evidence for was idiotic, but it would also rack up the legal bills for the other side substantially. He was game. By October, the story had expanded beyond the neighborhood. There were posts on Reddit about Karen, about the pool, about what could happen when you mix suburban isolation with access to a lawyer. The discourse split, as discourse did, into people who thought Karen was a wronged victim, and people who thought she was emblematic of everything wrong with homeowners associations and property obsession. Someone created a TikTok account dedicated to the pool incident. The videos got millions of views. Karen was painted as a villain in some, a victim in others. Marcus was unknown in all of them. He was just the placeholder for the kid, any kid, all kids, the threat to the ordered world. Rob Freeman's lawyer, Sarah, pulled him aside and told him they needed to talk seriously about settling. The legal fees were approaching $30,000. The publicity was destroying what remained of his reputation. Even if they won the case, they'd lose the war. I want to settle, Rob said. She doesn't, what do I do? You offer her something meaningful, Sarah said. Not money, she doesn't care about money. You offer her something she wants. Like what? Rob asked. An apology, a guilty plea from Marcus. We don't have either of those things. No, Sarah said, but you could have a conversation with her, not about the lawsuit, about why she's doing this. Rob didn't want to have a conversation with Karen Mitchell. Rob wanted to go back to the time before the lawsuit, before the pool, before any of this had happened. But he also had bills that couldn't be paid and a son whose school experience was disintegrating daily. He requested a meeting through Derek, who at first thought it was a mistake, but Rob was insistent. He wanted to talk to Karen, not as adversaries, but as neighbors. Karen agreed suspiciously. They met at a neutral location, the Riverside Coffee House, a place that had been there for 5 years and was neither good nor bad at anything. Rob arrived first and ordered a black coffee. Karen arrived exactly on time, ordered nothing, and sat across from him. I want to know why, Rob said, after what felt like an appropriate amount of settling in time. Karen looked at him like he'd asked a question without words. I want to know, Rob continued, why you're doing this. I want to know if it's actually about the pool, because if it is, we can fix the pool. We can pay for the pool. But this doesn't feel like it's about the pool anymore. Karen was quiet for a long time. She looked at her coffee shop, at the people around them, at Rob, and something in her face shifted. Something very small, barely perceptible, but real. It was never about the pool, she said finally. The pool was just the only thing I had that mattered, and someone destroyed it. And nobody cared, the police didn't care, the neighborhood didn't care, I had to make them care. By destroying my family? Rob asked. By pursuing justice, Karen said, and her voice was so certain, so clear that it was almost beautiful. I'm pursuing justice, that's all I've ever been doing. Justice for what? Rob asked. For a vandalized pool. Justice for, Karen paused, and something flickered across her face, for being invisible. For having everything and still being invisible, for building something and having it not matter. Rob understood in that moment that he was not talking to a woman who wanted money or admission of guilt. He was talking to a woman who'd lost something intangible a long time ago and had decided to reconstruct that loss as something tangible, something that could be sued for, something that could be fixed. He couldn't fix it, he wasn't responsible for it. But looking at her face, at the raw thing beneath the careful presentation, he almost wanted to try. The coffee shop conversation changed nothing official, but it changed something. Rob went home and told his wife that Karen Mitchell wasn't evil, she was just broken, which his wife didn't find comforting because broken people destroyed other people's lives all the time. Marcus, though, started to see the news differently. He started to see that everything that was happening, the lawsuit, the publicity, the social media attention, was about a woman trying to prove something to herself, and that his family was just collateral damage in that attempt. Which meant he could actually do something about it. He started researching. He looked up the incident at his old school, the thing that had gotten him transferred, and he realized that his parents had told him a different version of the truth than what had actually happened. They'd told him he'd punched Trevor because Trevor was mean to him, but the school records, which he found through a friend who knew how to get into the district's website, said it was because Trevor had said something about Marcus's mother being a slut. That was true. Trevor had said that, and Marcus had acted on it, and the school had put it in his file as a conduct violation, and his parents had decided that what he needed was a fresh start, and the fresh start had put him here in Riverside, where his impulse control problem had allegedly vandalized a pool he hadn't touched. He thought about the symmetry of it. He thought about the way that the system wanted him to be guilty anyway, might as well actually do something. At least then the punishment would be deserved. He was 14 years old. His reasoning had that quality of teenage absolutism that made it both completely logical and completely insane. At 2 a.m. on a Thursday in October, Marcus got out of bed, opened his bedroom window. He'd long ago figured out how to do it quietly, and made his way to Jennifer Chen's house. This time he took more than one bucket. He took 3. He took landscape dye in deep purple, dark black, and industrial orange. He distributed them among the various decorative pools and fountains around the neighborhood. The Richards family fountain, the small pond outside the community center, the fancy waterfall feature that the HOA had installed in the center of Riverside 2 years ago, at a cost of $180,000 that everyone in the neighborhood had been charged for. He didn't go to Karen's house. He was more strategic than that. He made it a statement, 3-bucket minimum, a signature. Then he went home and climbed back through his window and got back into bed. By morning, 8 different houses had confirmed damage. The community fountain was a disaster, completely dyed a murky black. The waterfall was unusable. Someone had dyed Jennifer Chen's own decorative pond, which felt like irony but was actually Marcus being honest about where the supplies had come from. The neighborhood app exploded. This was no longer a single incident. This was a pattern. This was a teenager operating with apparent impunity, destroying property across the entire community. Karen, who'd been at the center of the first incident, suddenly had company in her victimhood. Now she was part of a group of wronged property owners, all demanding action, all demanding that the police do something, that the courts do something, that someone finally actually stop this. Officer Hernandez, who'd been 1 week away from retirement, got called back in. He looked at the landscape damage and the news crews and the neighborhood in a state of panic, and he understood immediately that something had shifted. He also understood, with the clarity that comes from experience, that Marcus Freeman was the perpetrator here. Not because he had evidence, but because the nature of the vandalism, multi-site distributed signature, was too sophisticated for a random teenager. This was someone making a statement. He drove to the Freeman house at 8 a.m. with a search warrant, which he'd obtained based on the pattern and Marcus's previous suspicion in the first case. Rob opened the door in work clothes, already heading to a site, and saw the officer and felt his stomach drop in a way that never got less painful. "I need to search Marcus's bedroom," Officer Hernandez said. Marcus came down the stairs while they were searching, having heard his mother's voice in that particular tone that meant the worst thing was happening. He watched Officer Hernandez find the receipt for the vape in his drawer, the leftover dye stain on his work boots. He'd been sloppy this time, trying to move fast, not thinking about evidence because he'd already decided he was guilty anyway. Officer Hernandez didn't say much. He just took the evidence, read Marcus's rights because that's what you did, and told him they'd talk at the station. Rob Freeman sat on his kitchen island, head in his hands, and asked his son if he'd actually done it. "Yeah," Marcus said, "I did it, all of it. The first one and these ones, I did it." And Rob, who'd been fighting so hard to believe his son, felt something inside him break in a way that wouldn't come back together. The narrative shifted instantly. The news that had been about, could any of us be next, became about dangerous teenager finally caught. Derek Kessler was suddenly in a position where his civil case had been completely validated. His instincts had been right all along. The kid was guilty. The system worked eventually. Karen received a phone call from Officer Hernandez, asking if she wanted to add the other incidents to the complaint, if she wanted to pursue charges. She said she did. Marcus was charged with 5 counts of property damage, which was a felony in most cases. He was 14 years old. The trial became a public spectacle. Local news covered it. CNN ran a segment about teen vandal terrorizes suburban community. There were interviews with concerned neighbors, footage of the destroyed fountain, analysis of what had driven Marcus to do this. No one interviewed Marcus. He was a minor and he'd confessed, so there was no mystery to solve, no narrative to construct except the one everyone had already agreed on. He was a bad kid. He'd done a bad thing. He deserved punishment. During the trial, Marcus's lawyer tried to introduce evidence about his previous school situation, about the circumstances that had led to the move, about the psychological state of a teenager who'd been isolated and accused and decided to make the accusations true. But the judge wasn't interested in context. The judge was interested in facts. The fact was Marcus had committed vandalism. The fact was he'd caused significant damage. The fact was he needed to be punished. Sarah Chen did the best she could. She tried to argue for juvenile court, for leniency, for a system that understood that 14-year-old brains weren't done developing, that actions taken in desperation weren't the same as actions taken in malice. The prosecutor, a man named James Whitmore who'd been looking for a high-profile case to boost his electoral chances, argued that Marcus had shown a pattern of behavior, had planned the vandalism, had deliberately evaded detection, and therefore represented a threat to the community. "This is not a child who made a single mistake," Whitmore said. "This is a child who made a deliberate decision to destroy property repeatedly, to escalate, to involve the entire neighborhood in his crime spree." The verdict came in on a Tuesday morning, gray and cold, the kind of November day that felt like the world was already losing light. Guilty on 4 counts of property damage. Guilty on 1 count of felony vandalism. The judge, a woman named Patricia Hoffman who'd been on the bench for 18 years and had seen hundreds of cases like this, sentenced Marcus to 18 months in juvenile detention, with an additional requirement of probation until his 19th birthday, community service, and restitution of $43,000. Rob Freeman listened to the sentence and felt physically ill. $43,000. His company was barely operating at break-even. He couldn't pay that. His insurance wouldn't cover it because it was his son. They would be in debt for years, maybe decades. Karen Mitchell, sitting in the 3rd row of the courtroom, watched Marcus's face as the sentence was delivered and realized that she felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not triumph, not the closure she'd been certain would come when the system finally validated her rage. Nothing. She'd won, completely definitively, she'd won. The pool had been repaired, the vandal had been punished. Justice, in its most formal and official sense, had been served. And sitting in the courtroom, looking at a 14-year-old boy being led away to juvenile detention, Karen understood that she'd made a mistake somewhere along the way. She'd thought that winning would feel different. Officer David Hernandez, who decided to cancel his retirement and work the case, sat in the back of the courtroom and felt the full weight of what he'd done. He'd known Marcus was guilty the second he'd found the dye stains. He could have talked to the family, could have suggested a juvenile diversion program, could have pushed for community service without the felony conviction. Instead, he'd testified that the damage pattern suggested premeditation and intent, which was true but also weaponized. He'd let the prosecution frame a desperate teenager as a criminal. He'd let Karen Mitchell's certainty become the court's certainty. He would take early retirement after all. He would take it 6 months into Marcus Freeman's detention, and he would think about the boy every day for the rest of his life. Rob Freeman didn't cry in the courtroom. He cried in the parking lot, sitting in his truck with his wife beside him. He cried the way men who'd never expected to fail sometimes did, not dramatically, but completely, like every system inside him had come loose. "We have to appeal," his wife said, though neither of them had money for an appeal. Sarah said the conviction's solid, Rob said. Marcus confessed there's nothing to appeal. "Then we have to do something," his wife said. "We have to fix this." But there was nothing to fix. The system had worked exactly as it was designed to work. A crime had been committed. The perpetrator had been found. He'd been punished. This was what justice looked like. Marcus spent his first night in juvenile detention in a facility 30 miles outside the city. The beds were hard. The other kids were real criminals in some cases and just unfortunate in others. No one knew his story. To them, he was just another kid who'd fucked up. He thought about Corinne Mitchell and about the pool. He thought about the moment, standing at the edge of the deep end with the bucket in his hands, when he could have turned back. He thought about all the moments before that where things could have gone differently. Then he stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it was its own kind of torture, and he was going to be here for a long time. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal. The fountain was repaired. The waterfall was restored. The ponds were cleaned and refilled with clear water. By spring, it would be like nothing had happened except that it had, and everyone knew it had, and they'd have to live with that knowledge. Derek Kessler sent Corinne a final bill for the civil litigation. The case had settled out of court. Rob Freeman had signed papers allowing the civil judgment to stand, which meant Corinne had won both the criminal and civil cases. She received a check for $8,000, which was her portion of the property damage claims. She didn't cash it. She let it sit on her kitchen island for 2 weeks, then threw it away. She paid someone to dismantle the security cameras she'd installed. She stopped attending neighborhood meetings. She stopped reading the neighborhood app. She did, in fact, start using her pool again, but it was different now. The water was the same temperature, but it felt different against her skin. The color was right, but her eyes didn't trust it. David, her husband, came home for a weekend in December and asked about the pool. Corinne told him the short version. David nodded in the way he did when he didn't understand something but needed to move past it. He wanted to take a swim. Corinne said the water was cold. He went to the office instead. By January, Corinne had made a decision. She put the house on the market. It sold within 3 weeks to a young couple who just had twins and wanted a place with outdoor space for the kids to grow up in. The price was lower than she'd originally paid, but that wasn't the point. The point was leaving. She didn't go far. She found an apartment in the city downtown on the 15th floor of a building full of people who didn't know her, didn't care about her pool, didn't care about the neighborhood war that had defined her for 4 months. She furnished it minimally. She went back to therapy, which she'd quit years ago to focus on building. She started meeting friends for lunch instead of managing property. She never saw Marcus Freeman again. She didn't follow up on the case, didn't check the news, didn't go back to Riverside ever. She'd won, and the victory had been so complete and empty that she never wanted to see the place it had happened again. 18 months later, Marcus Freeman was released from juvenile detention on a gray March afternoon that was neither beautiful nor terrible. Just a day like any other day, except it wasn't. He was 15 years old when he went in. He was 16 when he came out. The difference between 15 and 16 wasn't usually significant, but in juvenile detention, it was an eternity. His mother cried when she picked him up. His father was working. He was always working now, trying to pay down the debt. His little sister, who'd been 11 when he went in, was now 13 and had learned to not mention her older brother at school. Marcus didn't say much on the drive home. His mother asked if he was okay, and he said he was. This was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that families agreed on, the kind that made it possible to move forward. The house was the same. The neighborhood was the same. Everything was the same except for him, and he was so changed that he could barely recognize himself in the mirror. He went back to Riverside High, which was not welcoming. He was the pool kid, and his story had been set in stone by a trial that had played out in the local news. There were whispers. There were jokes. There was a girl who wanted to mentor him, which seemed like it was about actual mentorship until it became clear it was about the fame of association. School was a place where he existed but didn't belong. He did the work. He maintained his grades. He was released from probation after 14 months for good behavior, and the good behavior was real, not performed. He'd learned something in detention that he couldn't quite articulate, something about how the world was a place where you could lose things and not get them back. His family was slowly, painfully rebuilding. His dad had paid down the debt to $18,000. His mom had gone back to work part-time. His little sister had stopped mentioning him at school. They were beginning to look like a normal family again, except for the hollow place where Marcus had been before the pool. Rob Freeman was in the backyard one Saturday in June, planting tomatoes for the first time in 2 years, when his phone rang. It was Sarah Chen, his lawyer. "I wanted to give you a heads up," she said. "The prosecution in Marcus's case filed additional charges related to the original pool incident. They're saying Marcus's confession covers all the incidents, and they want to include the carbon dating of the dye in Corinne Mitchell's pool as evidence that it came from the same source as the other incidents." "Didn't we already prove he did that?" Rob asked. "Legally, yes," Sarah said. "But someone, I'm not sure who, but I have my suspicions, has requested that the case be reopened based on new evidence. There's a possibility of charging him in a separate case, which would mean separate sentencing." Rob's hands stopped moving. His brain stopped moving. "Can they do that?" he asked. "Not without cause," Sarah said. "But someone's providing the cause. Someone wants to push this further." It turned out the someone was James Whitmore, the prosecutor who was running for attorney general and wanted a flashy case to boost his profile. A reopened vandalism case against a teenager he'd already sent to juvenile detention wasn't flashy, but a pattern of escalating crime. A teenager who was defiant even after punishment. A narrative about justice being insufficient. That was flashy. That was electoral gold. He pushed for the additional charges, and a new judge agreed to review the case, and suddenly Marcus Freeman was back in the system, fighting charges he'd already been punished for, caught in a legal mechanism that hadn't stopped because he'd served his time. He wasn't a minor in the new trial. He was 16, which meant he could be tried as an adult. Whitmore made that request, and the judge granted it. "This young man has shown a pattern of disrespect for the law, for property, and for his community," Whitmore argued. "The previous juvenile conviction was a failure to deter. He requires adult-level consequences." Marcus sat in the courtroom, listening to his own conviction being used as evidence that he needed to be convicted again, and felt something inside him calcify. He'd accepted the first punishment as just. He'd owned what he'd done. He'd tried to use his time in detention to become someone different. But this was a different system. This was an adult court, an elected prosecutor, a man building his career on the back of a 16-year-old's mistake. He was convicted again, this time on charges that carried a sentence of up to 5 years in adult prison. The judge, a different judge, seemed uncomfortable with the case. She sentenced Marcus to 3 years, with eligibility for parole after 18 months, but made it clear on the record that she believed the charges were redundant and the prosecution was overreaching. It didn't matter. Marcus was going to adult prison at 16 years old. The second conviction made the news again, but differently this time. There were op-eds about prosecutorial overreach, about the failure of the juvenile system, about the way that one mistake could destroy a life if the mechanisms were aligned correctly. Corinne Mitchell, living in her city apartment, read one of these articles and felt something sharp in her chest. She didn't go back to Riverside. She didn't contact the family. She couldn't contact the family. What would she say? But she did something quietly that no one would ever know about. She hired a lawyer and filed a motion to join with the defense in requesting that the charges be dropped as double jeopardy. The lawyer was hesitant. "This case is closed for you," he said. "You won. Why would you want to reopen it?" "Because I won wrong," Corinne said, "and I want to undo it." The motion didn't work. Double jeopardy requires actual acquittal, and Marcus had been convicted, so technically the law had room to operate. But the fact of her motion, the fact that the original victim was asking for the charges to be dropped, affected the court of public opinion significantly. Reporters dug into the story. They found that Corinne Mitchell had moved away, that she'd stopped pursuing the case, that she'd actually tried to undo what she'd set in motion. They interviewed her, and she gave them this. "I made a choice out of anger that had consequences for someone else's life. I convinced myself I was serving justice. But what I was actually doing was serving a story I told myself about being wronged. The pool was a symbol. But when I destroyed the person who allegedly destroyed the pool, I destroyed a real human being, not a symbol. I would undo it if I could. I can't. So I'm just telling you that it happened, and it's something I have to live with. The interview went viral. People had opinions. Some said she was being sincere. Others said she was trying to rehabilitate her image. Some said she was right to try to undo what she'd done. Others said the damage was done and her regret didn't matter. What mattered legally was that a judge looked at the case and decided that Whitmore had overreached. He reduced Marcus's sentence to time served, essentially releasing him on the basis that 3 months in adult prison was sufficient punishment for a crime he'd already been convicted and punished for. At 16 years old, Marcus Freeman walked out of a medium-security prison at 6 in the morning, carrying everything he owned in a plastic bag, and didn't know what to do with the rest of his life. His father picked him up. They didn't hug. They got in the truck, and Rob drove to work instead of home because there were gutters that needed cleaning on a job site, and normal life was the best medicine. Marcus worked beside his father that day, carrying supplies, learning the job, becoming part of the operation. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't healing. It was just what happened next. By summer, he had his GED. By fall, he was enrolled in community college, studying engineering. By the following spring, he was working full-time and school part-time, contributing to the family again, rebuilding something that might not be what it was before but could be something real. He never spoke about what happened in adult prison. He never spoke about Corinne Mitchell. He never spoke about the pool or the dye or any of the circumstances that had led him to become someone the system decided to destroy. He just lived, he worked, he went to class, he made quiet, careful choices about who to be. Corinne Mitchell, in her apartment, in her quiet life away from Riverside, continued her therapy. She painted. She volunteered at a legal aid society helping other people navigate the courts that had fascinated and horrified her. She didn't make large gestures. She didn't try to become a hero of her own story. She just lived with the knowledge that she'd done something that couldn't be undone, and she tried to be someone who would make different choices going forward. Officer David Hernandez took his early retirement and, ironically, ended up volunteering at the same legal aid society where Corinne worked, though they arranged their schedules so they wouldn't be there at the same time. He couldn't face her, and she didn't ask him to. They just existed in orbit around the consequences of what they'd both done. James Whitmore lost his campaign for Attorney General, though not because of Marcus Freeman. He lost it for reasons having nothing to do with anything except his own ambitions and miscalculations. He continued as a prosecutor, more careful now about which cases he used for his own advancement. The pool in Riverside was eventually passed on to different owners, people who didn't know its history, who used it for exactly what it was meant for, a place to cool off on a hot day. The neighborhood slowly forgot about the incident or filed it away as a story that happened once, a narrative that had played out and concluded. But in the individual lives of the people involved, the incident never concluded. It just became something they carried. 10 years later, Marcus Freeman, now 26, was working for a construction company and studying architecture at night. He was engaged to a woman he'd met in community college, someone who didn't know the whole story but knew enough. He was building something, slowly, carefully, with no expectation that it would be permanent. Corinne Mitchell, now in her 60s, had retired from the Legal Aid Society. She'd never married again. She'd never had children. She'd built a life that was smaller and quieter than the life she'd built in Riverside, and she'd come to understand that smaller and quieter were acceptable substitutes for perfect. She saw an article in the paper about Marcus Freeman receiving a scholarship to study architecture at Ohio State University. The article didn't mention the pool or the vandalism or any of the history. It just mentioned a young man who'd overcome obstacles and earned the opportunity to pursue his dream. She kept the article. She didn't know why. She kept a lot of things she didn't know why she kept. Pieces of a life that had happened, evidence that she'd been part of something, even if that something had been destructive. Marcus Freeman graduated from Ohio State with a degree in architecture. He became a junior architect at a firm in Columbus, working on commercial buildings and residential developments. His wedding was small, just family and a few friends. He didn't mention the pool. His wife knew he'd been in trouble as a kid, knew he'd been in the system, but didn't push for details. He was, by every measurable standard, fine. He'd survived the system. He'd become something despite it. He had a job and a wife and a small apartment and plans for a future. But he still sometimes woke up at 3 in the morning thinking about the moment he decided to dump the dye. about the choice point that had felt inevitable at the time but would follow him forever. Corinne Mitchell, at 71, was living in the same apartment downtown, now truly alone as her health began to decline. She'd developed diabetes. She'd had a heart attack. She was entering the phase of life where the body started keeping score. She volunteered less. She painted more. She thought about Riverside less. She thought about the pool even less. But sometimes, in the middle of a quiet afternoon, she would think about the boy and about the years she'd tried to take from him, and she would feel something between regret and grief that she could never quite name. She'd never written to him. She'd considered it many times, had drafted letters that she never sent. She didn't believe in apologies that centered the apologizer's feelings. She didn't believe in asking for forgiveness from someone whose life she'd damaged. She just lived with it. Officer David Hernandez had actually made it to his peaceful retirement. He lived in Florida now with his wife of 40 years. He golfed. He read. He tried not to think about the cases that had bothered him, the moments where he'd known better but acted worse. On particularly bad days, usually on the anniversary of Marcus Freeman's sentencing, he would pull up old news articles and read them, not to remind himself of what he'd done, but to understand again why he'd done it. The articles portrayed Marcus as a criminal, but Hernandez now understood something that he hadn't understood then. Media narratives and truth were only loosely connected. He'd let narrative take the place of truth. He'd let Corinne Mitchell's certainty become his certainty. He'd let a scared teenager become a criminal in his mind, because it was easier than admitting that the system could hurt innocent people just as easily as it hurt guilty ones. He couldn't undo it. None of them could undo it, so they just lived with it. There's a curious epilogue to this story, one that exists in the space between what was publicly known and what actually occurred. In 2029, 3 years after Marcus Freeman's graduation, a documentary filmmaker named Lisa Park became interested in the Riverside pool case. She'd come across the incident while researching stories about the intersection of property crime and obsession. She reached out to Marcus to ask if he'd participate. Marcus was hesitant. He'd spent a decade trying to move past the incident, to be someone other than the pool kid. But Lisa Park was persistent and kind, and she made it clear that her documentary wasn't going to be about vilifying him or glorifying him. It was just going to be about what happened and why. Marcus agreed. The documentary took 2 years to make. Lisa Park interviewed everyone: Marcus, his parents, Corinne Mitchell, Officer Hernandez, James Whitmore, the judge, the neighbors, the lawyers. She collected a complete picture. The documentary aired on a streaming platform in November 2031. It was called The Pool, and it became a cultural moment for exactly 3 weeks before the internet moved on to something else. But in that moment, something shifted. Corinne Mitchell, who was 75 and in declining health, agreed to participate in the documentary. She spoke honestly about her own emptiness, her rage, her understanding that the pool had been a stand-in for something more fundamental that she was missing. She spoke about regret in a way that was neither self-flagellating nor self-exonerating. She just stated facts. The documentary ended with her and Marcus meeting for coffee 15 years after the incident. They didn't hug. They didn't cry. But they sat across from each other and spoke about what had happened, and some portion of the truth got aired in a public space. Corinne Mitchell died 2 weeks after the documentary aired. She was 75 years old. She had pneumonia. She died at a hospital downtown with her nurse and a volunteer from the Legal Aid Society holding her hand, because her family was limited and her friends were few. Among her belongings was the newspaper article about Marcus Freeman's architecture scholarship. Among her belongings was also a draft letter to Marcus Freeman that she'd never sent, dated from 10 years earlier, expressing something that was never quite articulated but was full of regret anyway. Marcus Freeman received a call from the Legal Aid Society volunteer who'd been instructed by Corinne's will to contact him. Corinne had left him $5,000, the letter explained. "This is not an apology because I don't believe apologies work. This is not absolution because you have nothing to forgive me for. I did what I did, and you simply survived it. This is money that represents my understanding that I took years from your life, and this is a small gesture toward acknowledging that. I hope you use it in a way that means something. I hope you build something beautiful. I hope you don't think about the pool very often. I hope you live a life that proves that one person's rage doesn't have to define you forever." Marcus cried when he read it. He cried not because the money mattered or the letter mattered, but because it meant that Corinne Mitchell had spent her life thinking about what she'd done, and she died still thinking about it, still trying to undo what couldn't be undone. He donated the money to a legal aid society in Ohio that helped teenagers in the juvenile justice system. The donation was anonymous, but his wife knew. His parents knew, and that was enough. The pool in Riverside, the original point of conflict, had long ago been replaced by a smaller version. The new owners eventually sold to someone else, and that person filled it in and planted a garden. By the time the documentary aired, the pool that had started everything was literally nothing, just dirt and history and a story that people told. But the impact of the pool, the damage it had caused by being beautiful and expensive and defended so fiercely, that rippled out through the lives of everyone involved. Sometimes, late at night, Marcus Freeman would think about that moment when he'd tipped the bucket at the edge of the deep end. He'd think about the choice point, the moment where he could have done something different. But increasingly, he'd stopped blaming himself for that moment, because he'd come to understand, through years of therapy and living and just being, that 14-year-old boys in desperate situations weren't responsible for the entire system that responded to them. He was responsible for what he'd done, yes. But he wasn't responsible for Corinne Mitchell's response to it, wasn't responsible for the system's choice to punish him twice, wasn't responsible for the cascade of consequences that had tried to bury him. He'd survived it. He'd become something. He'd built his life not despite the pool, but because of it. Because he understood, bone deep, the way that rage and property and certainty could destroy people. And he worked in his quiet way to build things that were beautiful and didn't require destroying anyone to create. And that was the real ending, not reconciliation or redemption or justice or closure, just survival, just a life lived on the other side of something terrible with the knowledge that you were lucky to get there at all. The pool was gone, the incident had passed, but the people it had touched would carry it forever, and that was how you know something mattered, not by whether it ended, but by whether it left a mark that didn't fade.